Welcome to the Faith Trends Podcast, conversations that connect research with ministry.
My name is Lindsay Calloway. In today's episode, Rick Heemstra and I talk with Margaret Clarke, an assistant professor at Briercrest Seminary, who recently defended her PhD dissertation on clergy resilience. We talk with Dr. Clarke about what resilience is, how it can be developed and supported, and the common stressors and barriers to resilience in ministry. As a pastor's wife myself, this episode hits close to home. I hope you learn as much as I did from the conversation. And don't forget to stick around after. Rick and I will discuss our initial thoughts and takeaways. Margaret, Rick and I both have ties to the church pastorally and as lay people. And when you're in the church leadership inner circle, you become familiar with the terms in clergy care. You hear things like flourishing in ministry, clergy well-being, and then on the flip side, you hear terms like burnout or languishing. So I'm interested to know, what is resilience and what led you to study resilience with clergy in mind?
So I come at this topic from both, a number of perspectives. So first, I come at it personally. My husband has been a pastor for over 20 years. He's currently in a denominational role, but together we shared a joint sense of vocational calling to ministry, and we're involved in church work for a long time. So I had an interest there. I also actually have a lot of family members who are clergy when I was growing up, and then of course lots of friends and colleagues who are pastors. So that was an interest. Professionally, I'm a therapist. And so one of the groups I work with is actually pastors and their families, and just providing a supportive space to process some of the experiences they have. And then finally, I'm a professor at Briercrest Seminary. And we, of course, at the college and seminary, we educate pastors. And so there's both that piece, as well as how can we equip and prepare pastors for their role. Resilience is interesting. So it comes from the world of positive psychology. And so I think a lot of time in research, we're really good at studying the negative aspects of something and understanding that. And we need that to solve the problems. Resilience is really about the ability, and I love sort of a really simple version of it. It's the ability to bounce back from adversity. And so the fact is in everybody in life, we experience adversity to one degree or another. We might call it stress. We might call it challenges. Some people, it's quite traumatic, but we experience it. And it's our ability to sort of bounce back and recover from that and be okay. And so for me, I really thought resilience really is an experience for many, many pastors. They face all kinds of things. The role is quite interesting and complex. And so my interest was really about discovering more. There is a fair bit of research around some of the negative impacts for people in ministry. And I appreciate Duke University does a really great job understanding that and researching that, from health impacts and more like higher levels of depression. I was curious about what would people say helps them to be resilient? Like what would be the thing? So there isn't a lot of research out there on pastoral resilience. And so I did look a bit at some related professions. So I looked at teaching and I looked at nursing, because they're both got that sort of caregiving aspect. And so was able to see some things that those professions found valuable, and then was able to look. And so in my research, I really wanted to get an understanding of what are all the various things clergy pastors would say help them to be resilient. And that's, I think, the real heart of, I had a couple other research questions that were also very interesting, but that to me was the real heart of what was valuable about my research.
So Margaret, when I'm looking at your research, you have this idea of dynamic model of resilience. Mm-hmm. And I know for a lot of people, when we think about pastors, we might think that this is a really solid pastor and, they've kind of got everything together spiritually. And it's sort of this something built into their character that gives them that resilience. But I think that you're really using kind of a different model and an understanding. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So as I was looking at this, so there are a number of different perspectives on resilience. One is sort of that it's a personality trait. You either have a personality that's resilient or you don't. And then there's a body of kind of perspectives and research that really looks at it as a process, or in some ways kind of an outcome. And that was definitely the sort of process dynamic nature is really where I resonated, just based on sort of the understandings of resilience. And so I have an image I developed as part of my study, what I call the Clergy Resilience model. And it really is this sense of a balance, that we experience challenges and adversity, and it goes up and it goes down. But on the other side, balancing that is our resources, those things that we draw on that help us to bounce back. In addition to that, one of the things that also became clear for pastors in particular, there's also this mediating factor where the spiritual dimension, so there's theological meaning making and the sense of calling that they have in their relationship with God. It has sort of an overarching impact on both. And so when you talk about that deep well, I think that's sometimes what people are reflecting on, is that lots of pastors have the ability to deal with really adverse situations. And I think sometimes it's drawing on those things, their connection with God or their sense of partnership with God. But that also doesn't mean that those other factors aren't coming into play. And so I really am excited to contribute, because I hope this just raises that awareness of tuning into what is going on in any given pastor's life that's challenging. And then what are the resources they have? So it was really interesting. I did my data collection during the pandemic. It was between June and August 2020. So a great example of increased adversity, right? For most pastors, there was a level of increased adversity. For some, it kind of gave them a break. But for lots and lots, it was increased adversity. And so it was this interesting piece of kind of a live experiment where lots of them, what happened, they had increased workload. They suddenly had to become social media experts. So they had all these things kind of increase in their role. And in fact, some of them lost resources that they would have identified as helpful in the past. And so I think that piece of being tuned into what's going on, and it's always changing. So if there's church conflict, what happens there? And so I think that dynamic nature, with a balance, it's never settled. If you think about standing on a teeter-totter, there's never really a sense of like you've arrived, because it's always kind of balancing back and forth, and you have to shift with what's going on.
Okay, so you've talked about resources balanced against stressors. So if we think about, let's maybe focus on the stressors first. We know, and you have firsthand knowledge and experience of this unilateral nature of the pastoral role, and you really focus on the needs of others. We've even heard it said, I think Rick had heard it said, it's a privilege to burn out for Jesus. That can kind of be the mentality sometimes. So what areas are pastors most vulnerable to burnout or to experiencing stressors?
Mm-hmm. So my research, again, there's some really great research out there, especially connected with Duke around things like burnout. One of the things I did is, so I just asked, what are the adversity, what are the challenges you faced? And so got both from a national survey and then one-on-one interviews. And so I looked at, again, just broad themes, which were really consistent with the literature that's already out there, maybe gained some different insights. But one of the big challenges for clergy and pastors is workload. And that is everything from just the nature of the needs that there's emotionally and spiritual demanding needs that they face. The time, a lot of people, it's the demands that they are facing are beyond what's reasonable for time. Then the complexity. And this one, what I think was really, really interesting is the pastoral role is so complex now. And I especially in my interviews, people talking about, I have to be an expert in preaching. I have to be an expert in managing $1 million budget. I have to be an expert now in social media. I have to be an expert in this and this and this. And then I have to go from burying somebody to marrying somebody. And so that complexity is really challenging for clergy. The changing nature, the church is in a place of change. And so managing change is also a complex piece. And then just the relational dynamics that go on church, they can be very complex, whether it's with the pastor particularly, which some can be quite directed and involve the pastor, or some are just congregants and the pastor sort of has a role to play. So that is definitely a big part of it. With that, again, another category comes expectations. And this was sort of the breadth of this was very interesting. So again, some people talked about societal expectations and feeling like there's quite a negative kind of experience of being, in pastoral ministry, financial expectations, both for managing the church's finance, their own finances, denominational expectations were sometimes burdensome, congregational expectations, just lots and lots of different opinions coming at them. And then self-expectations. Most pastors hold this calling in such high regard, and that created challenges as well. And then specifically also some of the things that came out were that there are some specific expectations and barriers for women pastors in particular that were interesting. So a couple other categories: isolation. was another factor. And this was everything from like geographic isolation or being in a congregation or faith community that was theologically or culturally different and isolated. The relocations and schedules of clergy and pastors can be isolating. Role separation, this sense of either I don't feel comfortable relating with people or they don't feel comfortable with me because of my role, and how that isolates. Then just because of workload, decreased energy. It's kind of like I've given everything I have. I don't have energy to connect. And then peer competition was another isolating factor, where they just a sense of sometimes people don't feel safe with their peers because there's a sense of competition among churches. And then a number of personal challenges were quite adverse for folks if they're questioning their calling, if there's spousal or family conflict, if they're facing health issues, or just struggling sort of with relating and awareness in themselves. So very broad sense. And again, this doesn't mean that all pastors, all clergy experience everyone, but just wanted to get a really broad understanding of what is it that is challenging for pastors these days.
Margaret, maybe I could just follow up on, you talked about pastors and their sense of isolation, and you talked about some of the reasons there, but I was wondering if you could go into this a little bit more, because sometimes I think it's hard for lay people to understand why a pastor might feel isolated when they're working with people all day long. Mm-hmm. Can you help us to understand that?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I'm going to offer a little bit of reflection. So again, I'm a professional therapist, and there's very clear guidelines about my relationships with my clients. Right. And it's very clear that these are one-way relationships. I have my needs met in other relationships. People come see me and that's the expectation. I think church is far more complex. And so often in church, sometimes a lot of the relationships are one-way, where the pastor is pastoring and their needs aren't necessarily being met. And then this piece of sometimes there are, like one of the pieces that people talked about was this sort of challenge of friendships in the church, where it's not a one-way relationship, but it's mutual. And that gets really tricky for pastors, because there is some expectations that church is your whole life socially. And so if you don't have other relationships, and that's one of the really key categories of resource was relationships, and a lot of really interesting insights about how are those relational needs met when you're in this interesting role.
In your work, you talk about how resilience, pastoral resilience, is in part organizational or structural. And you have this idea that resilience is about a balance between stressors and resources. So how can organizations, the church being an organization, organize itself so that it's a better support for pastoral resilience?
Mm-hmm. One of the key things, and going into my research, so again, fields like nursing and teaching have been working with resilience a bit. And in nursing, there was a pretty good critique of this being applied and basically being, this is just an individual responsibility. It's on the individual. And so I appreciated that. Again, as a therapist, I'm a systems therapist, which means I consider problems in the context of systems, not just individuals. And I think resilience is very much that. It is about the combination of these things. So there certainly are these pieces of pastors needing to be aware of this and tune in. But then there's this piece of the role that congregations play, the role that denominations play, and the role that, education institutions play, and ideally the collaboration between the two. And this is the hardest piece, because as the church in Canada, there isn't sort of a centrally organizing factor. And some churches are, very much, they're just the congregation, and pastor is kind of, that's their main connection. But I think this piece of recognizing pastors as a really beautiful gift to the church and a resource that we need to help steward beyond just their individual responsibility. So, individually, we have a responsibility to care for ourselves so that we can continue to serve and to work in the ways that God has called us. But congregations play a big role. So if we think about some of the adversity, they are at times connected to that. And so expectations, unrealistic workload, competing demands, things like that are something that they can certainly look at. Also, this piece, for denominations, one of the things that came out was this piece of pastors in particular, when we were talking about this. So like, what do you need to help support you in this? There was a sense of they really longed for wellness standards, sort of an accountability towards some standards of what it means to take care of yourself. And with that, some support with that. So accountability. The challenge, of course, is there's this sense of they also wanted some measure of autonomy. So for not a heavy-handed denominations to come in and be like, you have to do this, this, and this, but still accountability. Because it can be hard individually to make those happen, especially when you have lots of demands on you. So some accountability, but with respect to autonomy. It was an interesting conversation. It was kind of like, yeah, we should, tell so-and-so what to do, but I don't necessarily want to be told what to do. So I think this balance of the two. And so some standards, some accountability, that sense of it is important how you're doing overall, that you're not a non-renew. You just can't keep going and going and going. We can't expect that of people, and we need to ensure that you're doing well in that, like what's going on, the challenges you're facing, but what are the resources that you're connected to? And one of the interesting things I will say, so again, I looked at a bunch of different Christian traditions. So I had the chance to talk with Catholic clergy and United Church of Canada and Anglican and, more of the ones that I'm familiar with in the Evangelical tradition. But I was really interested by some of the more structured traditions like Catholic. They have a very clear process of how people go into ministry. So they had a very rigorous discernment and preparation period, which was very interesting. Those who experienced that would actually point back and say that was helpful to my resilience. Partly, it really affirmed their calling, and it was like a foundation that they stood on. The other thing, though, in those seasons of preparation, it does seem like there's a unique opportunity where as pastors prepare, that they can be expected to engage in some things that we generally know are helpful, like mentoring. In the Catholic tradition, it's spiritual direction. They didn't necessarily, when they're later in their career, want to be told to do those things, but by requiring it when they were students, it set the stage. They learned that this was valuable. And I thought that was really interesting. So there seemed to be some developmental opportunities. So when people are preparing and students, there's some unique opportunities where we maybe are, requiring certain things as they go along in their career. It's maybe standards and accountability, but more flexibility in what they find helpful. So I thought that was really interesting too.
As we think about how some of these more institutionalized denominations, like the Catholic system or the Anglican system, how they seem to have more of a programmatic approach to discerning a call. How might evangelicals learn from that? And do you think that should be done at the local church level, recognizing people with gifts or certain skills from a young age and growing them up in the church and raising up leaders from within the church? We see that a lot in more new Canadian contexts, at least in the research that we've been doing. Or is this something that's the responsibility of seminaries and theological institutions, or even denominations? How might they get a look at how to really help pastors in their early days discern a call to ministry?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, and I think I don't have like the answer. I would love to see some research. I think there are some evangelical traditions that do this a little bit better than others. I do think that there are some that have been playing with the sense of an earlier connection point where the sense of calling is affirmed rather than just somebody kind of in their own individual sense going off and sort of sensing, okay, I think I should go into ministry, but without any affirmation or really sense of calling. And that goes two ways, I think. I think at times ministry is very complex, and there maybe are some people who end up in it that aren't well suited. And so that sense of we need to make sure we're affirming people in that sense of calling. But it was interesting how much of a grounding in tough times that was when people had that. And there were some I talked to who were more of like an evangelical tradition, but they had that really firm affirmation in their journey. And so when challenges came up, that was like a drawing. It's like, a well that fed them. It was like, yeah, like maybe I want to quit right now, but so-and-so and so-and-so. And at this point, this was affirmed. So I think I would love to see more research on that, because I think this sense of calling was really central and had this overarching impact, both on how the adversity and the resources, how all of that kind of was experienced for pastors. So, and I know that I can't just remember offhand what I know there for sure was one denomination that I spoke to somebody about, and they talked about a really great experience they had, and it was one that was more of the evangelical tradition. So I think there's lots for us to learn from one another, and I would love to just see us share that more.
So, Margaret, we've been having lots of conversations with pastors and denominational leaders, and we're coming out of this period of COVID where there's been lots and lots of stressors and probably not enough resources coming in behind to help offset that. What would your research say to pastors, churches, denominational leaders that are looking at pastors that are tired, really, really deeply tired? How do we address that tiredness so that it doesn't lead to a place where pastors either burn out or decide to leave the ministry? What can we do? What are some practical things that maybe out of your research or just out of your counseling practice?
That's a good question. I think, there were some things we definitely heard, like when one part of my questions when I talked with people also was like, what would you like to see? And it wasn't specific to COVID or any experiences it was during COVID, but they weren't speaking specifically about COVID. But this sense of having access and specifically financial support to things like retreats and sabbaticals. Also, two of the things that also there was a desire for is more access to professional counseling and more access to spiritual direction. So I think this sense, one of the things in my sort of therapeutic and my own journey experience, I think sometimes when you're in crisis, you just keep going and going and going until it's like, there is no more going. Because if you stop, you realize how tired you are. And so that's a really challenging place. I know as part of my research, I used what's called an interpretation panel, which is involvement of people who have expertise as like denominational leaders and educators and caregiving to clergy. And they talked about, a lot of our folks who are close to retirement are just saying, I'm done. And they just really didn't have it in them anymore to do that. And so I think this piece of recognizing, like, this is just not I think sometimes we take pastors for granted. We just think it's a continuous renewable resource. And churches, unfortunately, I think sometimes treat pastors this way. And I think denominations at times, and not maliciously so, but I think it's important to remember that this is really a precious gift that God has given us. So how do we do that? And that's the challenge does it mean everything's going to run the same way? If we're saying workload is a challenge, is there just a place of, if we have extremely tired pastor in a given situation, are there things that either other people have to pick up, or we just have to be okay with those don't exist in our church right now? Is there a need, if we're saying there's just real tiredness, there's not just a quick fix for that. And so it's like, how do we give space for things like sabbaticals and retreats to actually renew people? And that's where it's probably the concept of what do we expect of church is something I think that probably a lot of churches are going to need to step back and think about. And what does it mean to collaboratively either provide that, or what do we have to just recognize right now that's just not something that's realistic for our congregation or, again, our denomination? Are we okay to say things are going to just look a little bit different because we're going to actually enter into a season of rest? We have a season of extra stress. And what would it look like? Right? To everything there is a season. Perhaps we take some of that wisdom from Ecclesiastes and look at maybe we have to enter into a different season for our pastors and churches.
Love that idea of a season of rest. I wonder sometimes whether our churches will trust God to allow us to rest.
Well, and that's where so when we talk about some of the adversity pieces, when I talked about expectations, there was a lot of feedback on what some of the participants in my study would talk about as consumerism in the church, and that it is something that is very hard, right? Because it does feel like it's this sort of, it's not about serving God or living out our faith, but it can be this sort of demand that, we need this and this and this. It's about what I get out of church. And so perhaps this is a season where we're going to have to reevaluate what church is and what it looks like. I know there's a lot of fear about that. That was one of the negative kind of challenges that pastors were struggling with in COVID, was just this uncertainty about the future of the church post-COVID. Like, what's going to happen? What's it going to look like? And there may be things lost, but I also think in those points, there's like opportunities for things to be redeemed in beautiful ways. So maybe things that we've been holding on to that aren't actually necessary or good will be something that we'll have to reevaluate.
It sounds like congregations need this this collective shift in thinking. And it's hard when the person that is usually the one who helps guide that is the pastor. And if they're the ones trying to advocate for new seasons and rhythms of rest that actually might be a benefit to themselves, and rightly so, I think in many cases, you might not have the answer to this, but how do we try to change this collective thinking at a congregational level? I read a study a few years back from the Canadian Conference of Mennonite Brethren. They saw that congregational attitudes towards a pastoral spiritual wellness was generally not a high priority at a congregational level, but it was seen as a high priority at a pastoral level. So there's just like these two different pages that the congregation and the pastor can be on sometimes. Who helps fill that gap or move them closer?
Yeah, I think I think it's super challenging. And I think, it's interesting, as you were talking, it took me back. I did my master's thesis actually on the relationship between pastors and elders. And one of the things that stood out to me was this sort of the challenge of the difference between individual responsibility of the pastor and collective responsibility, and how what happens when there's collective responsibility, it's easy for no one to take it. Right. Or to kind of feel the responsibility. And that's why I think often in that kind of study, what I saw was a pattern of over functioning and under functioning, where because pastors, it was an individual focused responsibility, it was easier for them to sort of take it all. And then in that case, elders not experiencing that. But I think this piece of how do we, as at the end of the day, responsibility is individual, right? The individual makes action, takes choice, does that. But when it's a congregation that we need to change, that is challenging. And so often it becomes a leadership responsibility. And so I think this piece of thinking about that, I do think, denominations have an opportunity, but also kind of similar replication, right? Where it becomes like whatever a denominational leader. But I think they can have encouragement towards the congregation. I think when they have seasons where a congregation is struggling and say a pastor is on the brink of they need a rest for their well-being and continued ministry of what does that look like, and encouraging the congregation. It's complex. I don't think it's easy right now, but I think there's an opportunity for us to be rethinking church as we currently know it in Canada. Even though it's going to be hard, I think there's going to be some really beautiful opportunities for us to emerge on the other side. But I think some of it is going to be things like this that are going to be challenging.
Margaret, we're coming to the end of our time, and just as we draw this to a close, I was wondering if you could tell some people where they could learn some more about your work. We'll add this to the show notes as well.
Yes. Well, if folks want, I'm in the midst of, doing knowledge exchange. So I defended, this was my doctoral dissertation that I did for the University of Saskatchewan. So I defended in June. Now I'm in the process of doing publications, like writing articles in hopes of publication. So I don't have anything published yet, but I'm really happy to share specifically my heart. At the end of the day, I'm not actually an academic. I love teaching and equipping therapists. I also love working with people and equipping pastors. So if people want to get in touch with me, they can get in touch with me. I'm at Briercrest, and so it's Emma Clarke at briercrest.ca. You can find me on their website, and I'm happy to connect with people there. I don't have anything like published that I can sort of give, or a website with a lot of resources, but I'm happy to do that. And hopefully in the coming year or so, I will have some things further. There are some good tools out there. I will say the Wellness Project at Wycliffe, they've been doing some really interesting thing. Again, as far as from a research perspective, Duke University has some really interesting things as well. But working on that. And then there are a few books out there. It's called The Resilient Pastor. And it's just a really good practical book. It doesn't deal with all the exact same resources that I came out in my study, but it hits a number of them. So it talks about like nurturing your calling. So some really good practical advice there. That would definitely be what I'd recommend.
That's great. Thank you so much for joining us today, Margaret. In our conversation with Margaret, what stood out to you, Rick?
I was really intrigued by her idea of maybe we need a season of rest after a season of stress with COVID, and thinking about all the pastors that are just so very tired from keeping on top of everything. As a church, I think it can be a really scary idea to think about taking the time to recharge our batteries, because for a lot of people, there's a sense that everybody's been away and we have to get them back in that holy habit of going to church, and we need to set up our programs and start everything up. And I wonder if there's something to that.
Well, it's one of the quads in Bebbington's quadrilateral that is activism, isn't it? That is a mark of evangelicals. And so I think we feel like we are fulfilling our calling when we are active and doing something. And so how do we think about rest and the role of rest and Sabbath in that identity? I think that is something that we're going to have to grapple with, especially coming out of this pandemic season.
Something else that was really interesting about what she said was that part of pastoral resilience is organizational or structural resilience. It's this idea that how we've organized or structured our churches plays a big role in the resilience of pastors. And so I know anecdotally of situations where churches are considering changing the pastoral role to perhaps change the administrative burdens that pastors feel for things like doing all of the preparation for online church or things that they've been carrying over the COVID period. How is it that the churches have to change to have lay people pick up more of those roles? And just to think about that together it's a collective responsibility for us to make sure that pastors are healthy and resilient.
One of the difficulties of building in resilience at a systemic or organizational level is that it's hard to build flexibility into a system, isn't it? And so if you don't have something that's constant, it's hard to predict and to build systems around something that isn't. And I think that's just maybe one of the barriers at an organizational level.
Very good observation. I'm trying to think of what to say in response.
It's okay. So I don't know how we address that at the organizational level, but it is something that we need to be thinking about, I suppose, especially if it can have such an important impact on our pastors.
I think especially given that pastors are so tired that as churches, we at least need to be having the conversation about how we feed into pastoral resilience, how we help give them the resources to meet and recover from this long period of stress that pastors have been under during COVID, as we all have.
Thanks for listening. Find out more about the EFC's research at www.theefc.ca/research.